Welcome to the deep dive, where today we're diving headfirst into the Northern Song Dynasty. Imagine experiencing the streets of Kaifeng, their eastern capital, back in the 12th century.
And lucky for us, we have this incredible memoir to guide us. It's called The Eastern Capital, A Dream of Splendor. And it's, essentially a time capsule left behind by this guy, Meng Yuan Lao, who actually lived through it all.
So for our listeners, who are probably deep in their Asian studies programs, it's like, I don't know, almost like unearthing a blog, right?
Yeah.
From a time traveler. But instead of, those cryptic Instagram stories, we get these really rich descriptions.
Exactly. And like any good blog or, well, travel guide, I guess, he starts with the layout. Like he paints this really detailed picture of the city, the walls, the gates. It's like you could almost use it as a map today. He even says the outer wall was 40 li.
40. Okay, so for those of us who don't have that measurement memorized, how much ground are we talking here?
A li is about a third of a mile. So we're talking, over 12 miles just for the outer wall. And the gates, he describes them with these really interesting names like Southern Fragrance Gate. Each one seemed to have like its own specific purpose too.
Okay, so the city was ready for a siege or two.
Yeah.
But what about once you got inside those walls? What would we actually see walking through Kaifeng?
Imagine this. You walk through those gates, he describes them as white walls and crimson gates, and you're hit with this like sensory overload. Streets packed with people selling stuff, carts everywhere pulled by like oxen and mules, and the food, oh man, the food. He talks about roast mutton, candied fruits, all kinds of things. Basically, it sounds like every corner you turn, there's something amazing to eat.
And if I'm picturing this right, it's not just any old carts, right? I mean, we're talking about the big wooden wheels, maybe some squeaking axles, right?
Oh, absolutely. And it wasn't just, your everyday chaos. Meng Yuan Lao mentions this one bridge, the Chen Bridge Gate, that was only used by envoys from the Liao dynasty. So even back then, they were thinking about, international relations and stuff.
Yeah, it's those little details that really get me.
Ah.
Because it's one thing to read about like trade routes and envoys in a textbook,
Hmm.
but to imagine those diplomats using a specific bridge, that's, I don't know, that's just next level.
I know, right? It's like they're right there. And it wasn't just diplomats and merchants and all that. He makes this point that Kaifeng was a city that never slept. He talks about these night markets so crowded you could barely move, acrobats, puppet shows. He even mentions child wrestlers, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Okay, so I'm imagining myself there, right?
Yeah.
I spent all day dodging ox carts, shaking hands with diplomats. What's the move? Where's the place to be once the sun sets in Kaifeng?
Oh, he raves about this spot called the Inner Side. It was this night market just north of Zoo Bridge, and he describes it as just bursting with life. Carriages, horses, vendors selling everything you could imagine. Silks, snacks, you name it. And the sounds, music, laughter, he emphasizes how lively it all was, especially after they had just come out of this, like, war and a pandemic. So, people were ready to celebrate.
Oh, I bet. That's kind of universal, though, isn't it? I mean, war's over, pandemic's over, let's have some fun. Sounds familiar, right?
Totally. But the Eastern capital isn't just about, the good times and festivals. It also talks about like the everyday lives of regular people. For example, he says most houses were only one story.
Really? One story. Why was that?
Well, he mentions that building anything higher was, get this, seen as challenging the emperor's authority. So even the architecture was tied to this like social hierarchy.
Huh. Interesting. So speaking of the emperor, how does Meng Yuan Lao describe, the whole imperial court and everything?
Oh, yeah, he goes all out. Like, he describes these ceremonies, the palace. It's like something out of a movie. He talks about these processions, the emperor being carried in this fancy palanquins, soldiers everywhere. And get this, they had people, like, sprinkling water to keep the dust down.
Sprinkling water? So they basically made water routes just for the emperor to, I don't know, keep his robes pristine.
It's wild, right? And the detail, it's incredible. Like, he even has this whole thing about the emperor's favorite horse.
Oh, what is his name? Lightning or something?
Little Crow. And one day, apparently, this horse just refused to be ridden.
Refused. Just sat down on the job.
Yeah, basically. Until, get this, the emperor officially promoted it
Promoted a horse.
to the rank of, let me make sure I get this right, Dragony General, swear to God.
You've got to be kidding me. So, I mean, was that a joke or was there some deeper meaning there? I mean, we're talking about emperors and Mandate of Heaven.
Who knows, really? That's what's so cool about these primary sources. You get these little glimpses into their personalities. Stuff you'd never find in a textbook. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's not all, funny stories about horses. He also has this really detailed account of the Winter Solstice Festival, which was like their big celebration of the year.
Okay, so we're talking like major cultural event here. Give me the rundown. What happened during this winter solstice thing in Kaifeng?
Imagine, like, weeks beforehand, the whole city is getting ready. He talks about them training musicians, carriages, even elephants for months.
Elephants? Hold on, elephants in China? I mean, don't get me wrong, that's amazing, but that's not exactly the first thing that pops into my head when I think 12th century China.
Right. And he goes into detail about, how they train them using these bronze awls. And then, get this, they taught the elephants to bow when they reached this tower, the
Right.
announcing virtue tower.
To bow. Like these massive elephants all bowing in unison. Talk about a spectacle. But I have to imagine this wasn't just for show, right? I mean, we're talking about the Northern Song Dynasty here. There had to be a deeper meaning.
Oh, absolutely. The winter solstice wasn't just a party, it was a whole thing. Like, he says the emperor would spend the night at the Grand Temple, make sacrifices to his ancestors. He even had these purification rituals at this place called the Fasting Palace.
Wow, so this is about like tradition, connecting with the past, really solidifying that whole mandate from heaven thing.
Exactly.
But after all that serious stuff, did the people get to have any fun?
Oh, for sure. He talks about these huge festivals with acrobats, dancers, musicians. He even mentions like water puppets, basically puppets performing on boats.
Water puppets, I've never even heard of that. Talk about creativity. Any other festivals he mentions that stood out?
The Lantern Festival sounds pretty wild. He describes this giant scaffolding shaped like a mountain covered in lights and decorations. People would come from all over just to see it. And the streets would be packed, performers everywhere, music. It sounds amazing, like the Times Square of its day.
I bet. Man, this is really painting a picture. It really makes you realize that some things never change, right? I mean, the need to celebrate, to come together, it's timeless.
It really is.
But it couldn't have been all festivals and celebrations, right?
Yeah.
We talked earlier about how Meng Yuan Lao, he doesn't shy away from the realities of life in Kaifeng. What kind of stuff does he say about that? So we were talking about how Meng Yuan Lao doesn't just focus on the glamorous side of Kaifeng, right? What did he have to say about, like, the not-so-glamorous parts of daily life?
Well, he talks about how crowded it was, like really crowded. He actually says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically says that even if thousands more people came to the city, you wouldn't even notice. And if they left, it wouldn't feel any emptier.
Wow, that's something else. I mean, talk about painting a picture. You can really get a sense of just how many people were crammed into this city. It makes you think about, like, the living conditions, right?
Yeah, for sure. And he doesn't sugarcoat things either. Like, he talks about how during the Lantern Festival, they would actually put criminals on display.
On display?
Yeah.
Like, what, as part of the entertainment?
Basically, yeah. It was like I don't know, a warning to everyone else, I guess. And he even describes some of the punishments, which, let's just say, they were a bit different back then.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's easy to get caught up in, the beauty and the excitement of a place like Kaifeng. But it's important to remember that it wasn't all sunshine and roses, right?
Exactly. There was a darker side, too. But what I find really interesting is that even though Meng Yuanlao saw it all, the good, the bad, he still manages to be pretty even-handed in how he writes about it.
It's like he's trying to be objective, right? Like a historian, even though he was living through it.
Yeah, like he knew this was important, not just for his time, but for the future. He even says at one point that he probably missed things and encourages, like, future readers, us, to fill in the blanks. Which, I don't know, I just think that's so cool.
It really makes you think about how we understand the past
Right.
and what people will use to understand our time, hundreds of years from now.
Right. Like, will it be our TikToks, our Twades? What will they think when they see all that?
What a thought. It's kind of humbling in a way, right? Because we're all making history every day, whether we realize it or not.
Totally. And maybe it's those little things, the everyday stuff, that ends up being the most interesting in the end.
That's a great point. Well, on that note, I think we've done a pretty good job of diving into the Eastern capital, wouldn't you say?
I think so. It's amazing how much you can learn from just one book, right?
Absolutely. And a big thank you to all our listeners for joining us on another deep dive.
Until next time.